Now let's discuss the second international strategy tool that we introduced in the beginning of this session. And this tool can be used to help a company after they have decided what mode of operation is most suitable for their international business. Remember, the best mode of operation, licensing, direct or indirect, exporting, foreign direct investment, etc., was determined from the OLI analysis we discussed in the previous video. Now, this second tool is called the IR grid. So maybe you're wondering, what does the I and R stand for? Well, the I refers to the necessary level of integration in a company's international business. How integrated the different activities and processes need to be. And the R refers to the level of responsiveness required on a specific target market. In simplified terms, what the IR grid allows a company to do is to determine the best way to deal with two conflicting pressures which companies face when entering or developing a foreign market. And those two pressures involve the level of integration of their activities and the responsiveness to the local market. So now let's say a few words about each of those two pressures. The first pressure involves integration. The pressure for integration on a target foreign market will be determined by how connected and combined a company's activities need to be or should be in order for that company to maximize efficiency. As an example of this, imagine for a moment you're working in a company that has a fairly standard global product offering, for example, a Mars bar or some other standard product. Customers all over the world are familiar with Mars bars, and as a result of this, it's quite standard. As a matter of fact, production processes, technology, product design, distribution channels, and other activities might also be fairly standardized. And as a result of this high level of standardization, it would make sense for Mars to integrate all of their international activities as much as possible in order to maximize their efficiency. And the benefits of that integration might involve centralization of production facilities on a few markets, larger scale production processes in a few places, the location of production facilities or marketing and distribution, etc., in just a few key locations around the world, and a great deal of learning within the organization, because all of these activities are highly integrated, and that enhances the learning in the company. The second pressure was called local responsiveness. Local responsiveness needs to be considered because every foreign market is different in terms of local market needs and requirements, otherwise known as the level of local responsiveness. The need for local responsiveness might be determined by consumer differences in each market, cultural differences, history of a country or their national heritage, local government policies, business regulations, competitive conditions in the marketplace, and other factors. In some cases, a company might have to better meet those local needs on a market or increase their responsiveness in order to be effective on that market. Now let's describe some practical examples of how the IR grid might be used to determine the need for integration or responsiveness on a foreign market. But first, imagine for a moment that you're thinking about the best way to operate on a specific foreign market that seems attractive for your company. To decide the best way for your company to operate on that market, you could use the IR grid. You could start doing that by drawing a 4-quadrant grid on a piece of paper. On the bottom of that grid, you write industry pressure for responsiveness. On the bottom left, you write low level of pressure for local responsiveness. And on the bottom right, you write high level of pressure for local responsiveness. On the left side of the grid, then you write pressure for global integration. And then on the top left, you write high pressure for local global integration. And on the bottom left, you write low pressure for integration. So you have your grid with the 4 quadrants. Now you've created the grid, which you can begin to use in order to see where your company might fit in that grid. Next, you select a foreign target market, which you have researched and for which you have determined that the country has some opportunity for your business. Might be in Europe, Asia, a local country, etc. From there, you would consider the 4 quadrants of the IR grid one at a time. Based on the need for responsiveness in the country you're studying and the need for integration of your different business activities, your company strategy for that market could be determined. This is how the IR grid can be useful to you. So now let's talk about each of the 4 quadrants in the grid and discuss some examples of companies in each of those 4 quadrants. And that will help us understand this tool in more depth, so it can be more useful to us. In the bottom left box in the IR grid, you could name that international strategy. In this box, we might have a company like Sekkingstad AS. Now, it's a bit difficult name, but it's a Norwegian name, and they are one of Norway's largest independent suppliers of Atlantic salmon. And by the way, the country of Norway is the world's leading producer of Atlantic salmon and the 2nd largest seafood exporter in the world. So we could say that Sekkingstad AS Norway have a pretty standard product, salmon. And in fact, that product is pretty generic or common all over the world. Salmon is salmon is salmon. And all of Sekkingstad's production and processing facilities are located in Norway, and they're exporting the majority of their fish or other products. Europe is their main export market. So Sekkingstad have a low-level need to adapt their product on individual target markets, and they can keep their business centralized in Norway. In other words, their need for responsiveness is low. In addition to this, Sekkingstad can have standard and centralized operations in their processing facilities and packing facilities, which give them a high level of control. In other words, they have a low-level need for global integration also. So Sekkingstad AB Norway would be a typical company who face low pressures for local responsiveness and low pressures for global integration. And in fact, an international strategy would best suit that company, Sekkingstad, for their salmon exports. But now let's move to the bottom right box of the IR grid, and things get a little bit more complicated there. And we could name that box multi-domestic strategy. And companies who find themselves in this multi-domestic box have a high level of pressure for local responsiveness, but a low level of pressure for global integration. Now, can you think of any companies that might fit into this multi-domestic box? Well, we might place Banco Santander retail banking. Banco Santander are the 17th largest bank in the world, and we could put them in this box. And Banco Santander is a Spanish banking group who have expanded internationally by acquiring other banking companies throughout the world. In fact, Santander are the 37th largest company in the world today. And the reason we placed Santander retail banking in this box is because their need for standardized and centralized control is useful, but not necessarily occurring across all of their operations. But more importantly, for Santander to be effective on local retail banking markets in different countries, they have had to adapt their activities, including some decentralization, and to offer some customized products based on the needs of customers in each market they operate on. So Santander Retail Banking is a very good example of a multi-domestic strategy in the IR grid. And now let's shift to the top left box of our IR grid. And we could name this box Global Strategy. What do you think? What company might fit in this global strategy box at the top of the grid? Well, a good example of a company that fits in this box is the Boeing Aircraft Company. And Boeing are the world's leading manufacturer of commercial jets, and they're America's biggest manufacturing exporter. In fact, Boeing export to more than 150 countries around the world. So why did we place Boeing in the global strategy box? What do you think? Well, we placed Boeing in the global strategy box because most of the Boeing aircraft sold around the world are fairly standard, even if there are some local needs to meet, such as the interior colors or the seating or the power plants, the engines, etc. But in general, a Boeing 737, for which they have delivered more than 9,000 since they first started building them in 1965, is pretty much a standard product produced in the United States. A 737 is a 737. By the way, that top class 737-900 costs something about like $100 million to buy today, new, if you can afford it. Now, the high level of standardization at Boeing means that they must have very centralized control across all of their international activities. And Boeing do this in order to maintain control over the technical standards, safety, and also quality and cost. So Boeing are a great example of a global strategy company. Finally, we have the box on the top right of the IR grid. And we could call this box Transnational Strategy. Can you think of a company that might fit in that box, Transnational Strategy? Well, there are a lot of companies that fit in that box, but as an example, we could put Amazon Marketplace there. Now, Amazon online marketplaces are present in 11 different countries around the world. And the product assortment offered in China, Japan, Mexico, Germany, etc., on those markets can differ considerably. This is because Amazon must adapt their business model based on the needs of the markets such as Japan, Mexico, China, etc., because the customers on those markets have very different needs. But Amazon also need to have a very high level of standardization in their platform throughout the world, along with centralized control back in the US of technology development and other things. This means that Amazon are operating a transnational strategy in our IR grid. So the IR grid can help a company determine their best international strategy, but it can also help determine the best form of organizational structure for different markets that they're considering. And the IR grid can also help a company understand better the need for change in their strategy and their positioning on markets over a period of time. The IR grid can also help managers determine the level of threats or opportunities in a marketplace, if they are present or if they're coming in the future, due to the changes in cost structures or political pressure or competitive conditions, etc. But it's important to remember that companies can migrate from one strategy to another as their international business develops and the need for responsiveness or integration grows in their business. In addition to this, the IR grid analysis can also help managers to decide what changes might be needed at a business function level, such as manufacturing, finance, marketing, and other functional areas. So it's a very useful tool. To end the discussion on the IR grid, here's a crazy example of how the grid can help analyze a marketplace. Now, Dunkin' Donuts are a U.S. coffee chain and donut chain which was established in the 1950s. And Dunkin' sell more than 52 types of donuts and serve more than 3 million donuts every day. Oh, sorry, not donuts, but customers around the world every day. And the company has more than 11,300 Dunkin' Donut restaurants worldwide. And China is just one of the foreign markets that Dunkin' operated. Okay, how does the IR grid help Dunkin' in China? Well, Dunkin' China realized quickly they had to respond to the local Chinese taste by adapting their donut flavors for that market. And as an example of that, Dunkin' offers seaweed donuts, sesame donuts, and pork floss flavored donuts in China. And those are flavors that most American customers would not find very appealing. So the IR grid helped Dunkin' decide how responsive they needed to be on the Chinese market in order for them to be effective and to gain market share in that market. And that's very useful. And the IR grid also helped Dunkin' determine how integrated they need to be in China in order to maintain efficiency in their operations. So the IR grid is a useful tool in international business. Well, that again was a lot of information to absorb. So what are the 3 lessons you should leave this session with? Number 1, the first lesson is that the main reason most companies explore international business opportunities is because they're seeking market opportunities. However, in some cases, a company may just be looking for resources or know-how or labor, low labor cost, etc., which can help them to be more competitive. The second lesson is that many companies start their international activities in a country which is close, familiar, and has similar business practices and needs in comparison to their home market. That's important for learning and understanding how to carry out international business. And finally, the third lesson is that companies must always consider their advantages. For example, do they have ownership advantages? Do they have internalization advantages? And do they have location advantages which might influence how they operate abroad? And they must also consider the needs for integration or local responsiveness on each foreign market being considered in order for them to be successful in international business.